Hello and welcome to another episode of interest.co.nz's Of Interest podcast. I'm Gareth Vaughan. My guest today is the University of Auckland's Tava Olsen, and the topic is the supply chain. Tava's well placed to talk about this as she's Professor of Operations and Supply Chain Management and Director of the Centre for Supply Chain Management at the University of Auckland Business School. Welcome, Tava, and thank you for joining us. Supply chains obviously have, they're one of those things really that a lot of us don't really think about until something goes wrong. And, we take them for granted, I guess, that we order something and it turns up when we want it to turn up or when we expect it to turn up. Now, of course, the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic globally changed things quite dramatically, and things certainly did go wrong. COVID's highlighted the fragility of global supply chains, and obviously for a trade-dependent country at the bottom of the world, with very long lead times like New Zealand, this has been a big deal and continues to be a big deal. I can remember starting to hear about COVID-related supply chain problems in probably about October 2020, which was then in the context of delays and stuff arriving from overseas for Christmas, which people were beginning to talk about. So to kick us off, Tava, I was just wondering if you could explain just how the pandemic messed up global supply chains.
Sure, and very nice to be here. So supply chains don't do well with lumps, uncertainty, delays. They work best when they're all flowing smoothly, just product flowing from one end to the other, like water. That's the ideal from a supply chain perspective. And what the pandemic did was, of course, mess that all up. So there were changes in demand patterns and there were changes in supply patterns. And together, that just made a very, very lumpy supply chain that had major issues. So as a supply chain academic, I was actually starting to talk about supply chain issues well before the October because, we were looking at our supermarkets and they were out of flour, for example, and the whole toilet paper around the world made big news, and it's not surprising because that's a product that usually has very nice, smooth, constant demand. And so you add in some bumps and it doesn't go well.
Absolutely. One of the things I remember hearing about was that obviously when the world went into lockdowns, especially in the US being the biggest economy in the world, people's spending patterns changed. And instead of going out to restaurants or bars or cafes and spending money, they were staying at home and ordering things off the internet. So this messed up the flow of containers between the US and China in particular, obviously the world's two biggest economies, and then that flowed on to the rest of us. Was that a big part of, I guess, what influenced the problems even in New Zealand?
Yes, and so there was more ordering online, but there was also more differences in what we consume. So, for example, we ran out of flour, but we didn't actually run out of flour. What we ran out of was the small bags to pack flour in. And it actually took a while to produce those bags again. That's why you saw those big, 5-kilo bags in the supermarkets, because there's plenty of flour and plenty of big bags that would usually be being used by bakeries, but the bakeries were closed. And people were trying to home bake, so we ran out of the bags. So that's just one example of what went wrong in terms of that supply chain.
Yeah, I can remember in our neighbourhood there was one dairy that had flour, and so my wife made a beeline there one day with one of our kids. Yeah. It was a strange time. There were obviously there were stories too in 2020 and again last year of some of our bigger exporters chartering their own ships to keep their products flowing overseas. I'm guessing times were probably even tougher for our smaller companies because they wouldn't have had the scale or the scope to actually do that. So how have they been coping through this?
Not well. So obviously they don't get very high priority in terms of shipping capacity. And so what they've learned to do is just have even longer lead times. So there's a lot of extra stock being held at various points in the supply chain just because they can't guarantee that anymore that they'll get it 6 weeks after they order it, for example. So that adds cost, right? It adds cost because you're tying up your capital in the inventory that's just sitting there, not being sold.
Yeah, and that cost issue is an interesting one because obviously pre-COVID, everyone used to talk about the just-in-time model, right? So keeping low levels of inventory and you just, get things in when you needed them and wanted them. And that's obviously changed, I guess, the balance between cost and service, and the business continuity being more important perhaps than costs. Is this a permanent change, do you think, that's happening? Or is this going to just, I mean, there's a lot of talk now about onshoring manufacturing, particularly in the US, because Shanghai is obviously still having lockdowns and it's messing up shipping still. Is this something that's going to be permanent?
I think there are some permanent changes, but what I find quite funny is when I started my career, we talked about just in time, and then it got a bad name, and then we talked a lot about lean, and then now we're back to talking about just in time, which is really the heart of lean. Lean is good because you keep the costs down, right? So again, that visualization of things flowing like water, not a lot of bumps, not a lot of extra inventory, that's the low cost way to produce. It's just not resilient. So what I think has changed is this awareness that there is a trade-off, right? You can hold extra inventory, be more resilient, be more responsive, or you can hold lower inventory, less cost, but it's more dangerous because you know those risks, those shocks you can't absorb.
Yeah, I mean, there's scope for more to go wrong, I guess, isn't there?
There absolutely.
Yeah. Now, obviously, I think the figure I've seen is 99% of the volume of our exports travel by sea. I thought it was interesting during the well, I say during the pandemic as if it's gone. Obviously, we still have plenty of COVID with us. But the government obviously stumped up quite a lot of money, public money, to keep air freight moving. But they didn't do this with sea freight. Was that perhaps surprising?
Well, the government generally doesn't try and interfere with private enterprise. So we, as you already mentioned, we saw these companies that were chartering their own vessels. So I think even though it was painful, the sea freight was still limping along. So I don't think it's that surprising that government didn't jump in and try and fix it. Whereas the air freight, I mean, we weren't flying people around, which meant that all those holds that usually carry goods weren't going. So, I mean, the decrease in capacity in air freight over COVID was just, huge.
Yeah. I wonder, though, with those smaller companies, the smaller New Zealand exporters, obviously it was really tough for them. We do have our national airline in Air New Zealand. Has there been any discussion of perhaps whether we should have a national shipping line?
Not that I've heard. Doesn't mean and not that it means it's not worth discussing, because if you want resilience, if you want to be able to absorb shocks, etc., then probably there's a role for government, because you can't really expect companies to just carry all that extra costs on their books, particularly if it's extra costs for society rather than extra costs for their own business. So there is a role. It might be an interesting conversation to have.
I read an article that your colleague David Robb wrote a few months ago that I thought was really interesting. In this, he talked. One of the things he talked about in it was what Switzerland does in terms of maintaining a system of compulsory stocks of goods through a public-private partnership. I'm just wondering whether maybe that's something that New Zealand ought to be looking at. Obviously, what we would hold would differ to what Switzerland holds. But is that something that we could perhaps be looking at doing?
We absolutely need to be looking at that. So I don't think anybody has done the stock take of, suppose there was war and our borders closed, what are we going to run out of that's going to be critical supplies, and how fast will we run out of it? And those would be the places that it would be a role of government to say, okay, I'm not okay with New Zealand having no. So, for example, we've closed down Marsden Point. We don't carry a lot of fuel reserves. We have the options we have are options to buy fuel at the current global market price. So that's not giving us a lot of benefit. We hold it because of international agreements. But, we really need to take a good hard look of, what if our borders actually closed? Because, yes, hopefully it's not going to happen. But it is something that could happen. And I'm not convinced anyone's taken a good hard look at, where are those critical needs that we really should be thinking about.
Yeah, I mean, fuel is an obvious one you mentioned, but I was interested to read a bit further on this. And some of the things at risk in food areas, for example, extend to things like sugar, wheat, maize, rice, and coffee. I mean, we don't want to run out of coffee, do we? So there's a lot of things we could bring into this discussion.
Yes, although I think we don't want to run out of coffee, but we can live without coffee.
I don't know.
Okay, but it would be painful. But it's it's not on the same level as fuel and medical supplies, right? So I'm not going to start suggesting the government has their coffee reserves for.
Because that was one of the things too in the early days of the pandemic, medical supplies, PPE, that personal protective equipment. I have been reading about this push to onshore or reshore in the US with multinationals that were looking at China now building new factories in the States. We're obviously a much smaller economy, but is there any evidence of that going on in New Zealand, that people that maybe were looking at setting up overseas are staying here as our market, just too small for them to do that?
I think we're too small. I mean, so most of what I've seen is just carrying the extra inventories, but still offshoring. But it probably would take government intervention in terms of subsidising setting up some of those very high capital equipment, and you'd want to be careful about that, obviously.
Yeah. Now, an interesting thing that is going on against this backdrop is the Ministry of Transport looking at developing what it describes as New Zealand's first ever comprehensive freight and supply chain strategy. They released an issues paper recently, which I'm sure you're familiar with. In it, the Minister of Transport, Michael Wood, said the government is taking action to future-proof our supply chain, limiting the impact of the next global shock on our businesses across the country. This is a very ambitious idea. Is a comprehensive national freight and supply chain strategy a good idea, and what would we need from it?
So first, let me say I've read the document. I think they've done an excellent job of outlining the background and all the issues, and definitely recommend reading it. But having said that, I don't think a national supply chain strategy makes much sense. A freight strategy, maybe, quite possibly. But, in our very first class on supply chain, what we teach is that you don't have one supply chain strategy. You have to match your supply chain strategy to the type of product. So, Fisher Paykel Healthcare exporting their high-tech, light masks are going to need a completely different supply chain than Fonterra exporting their low-value, heavy milk powder bags. Those are two fundamentally different supply chain types. And if you look at what you're going to emphasize, you're going to emphasize responsiveness for Fisher Paykel Healthcare, and you're going to emphasize minimizing cost for the Fonterra milk powder. So, the other issue I have with their proposed strategy is they don't seem to recognize that. So they want productivity or efficiency, and they want responsiveness or resilience, and yes, we want both of those, but where's that trade-off? Which one do we want to emphasize? Well, it depends on what product we're actually thinking about. So I think coming up with a country strategy for supply chain, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And coming up with a country strategy for freight, thinking about the modes we want to use and whether we want to subsidize rail more or roads more or coastal shipping more, that makes a lot of sense. So yes, we should be thinking a lot more in terms of our strategic planning for our country's freight networks. Your question on whether the government should be subsidizing a national sea freight. Yeah, I don't know, but let's have that conversation. But I think to bring it up to supply chain, it's how can we have a national supply chain strategy?
Isn't there, I guess coming back to those smaller businesses though, I wonder, is there not any scope for some sort of national, strategy to help out them? Because I guess if I take your point about different industries and different needs, etc. But if you're a small New Zealand company who's exporting to, say, China, if you pull your resources together with other small New Zealand companies, doesn't that give you a bit more market power with the container shipping lines who from all reports I see are rorting people at the moment with the prices they're charging?
Yes, but I wouldn't call that a national supply chain strategy. I mean, we definitely should be thinking around, what can we do to make things more efficient, more effective, to increase collaboration. We're not actually very good as a country with collaboration. We have far too many empty trucks driving around our roads because, people are not actually collaborating on those trips. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, one of the points on that I've read is that obviously a lot of imports come into Auckland and then get trucked off around the country, and then 40% of those trucks come back to Auckland empty, for example. So how can we address an issue like that?
Well, there's certainly been attempts to address it. So, for example, that is Coda's business model. I mean, Coda is largely owned by Fonterra, and I'm not going to remember who else, but their business model is to try and fill up those back legs, and there have been other startups trying to do that. And then I think comes back to your question of, is there a role to tip the scales a little bit more in favour of those sort of collaborations? Maybe. But I do think it also comes down to our role as universities, which is just sort of educating people on the importance of collaboration and the possibility of creating win-wins. It doesn't have to be win-losers. If I can put my stuff on your truck going the other way, then it's lower cost for me, it's lower cost for you. We just have to figure out those coordination mechanisms. So it really is teaching people about win-wins are possible.
You do say that a national freight strategy is a good idea, and that's obviously part of what the Ministry of Transport is looking at.
Yeah.
What do we need on that? I mean, one of the ideas that comes up regularly is, people say we have too many ports, for example, too many import-export ports around the country. We should move to what is referred to as a hub and spoke model, where we have one or two ports where international ships come into. Bigger ships could come in if it was, Tauranga, for example. And then we have a sort of feeder around the country, whether it be coastal shipping, trucking, train, rail, or a combination of all of them, I guess. It seems to me that this idea has been around for as long as I can remember. Ports are often owned by local government. There's quite parochial ownership, so it never seems to change. But is that something we should be really trying to do at a national level?
It's something we should be thinking about, and I think you've hit the nail on the head in terms of it is the local government control that's preventing sort of any sort of efficiencies shaking out. I mean, if they were all in private ownership, which is not what I'm advocating, but if they were, you'd see one port buying the other port, and you'd get that consolidation happening pretty quickly if it was actually a free market. Yeah, you could be doing it with the free market. You could be doing it with government central control, but with local control, it's just not going to happen. So one of those two choices you could be making, but the current local control, there's no incentive to try and consolidate. You just do what's best for Auckland, and yeah, that's what Auckland local government needs to be thinking about. But is that really what the country should be doing in terms of our ports? Well, that's a different question, right?
And obviously that debate sparks up every now and again, but nothing seems to happen. I mean, if COVID isn't a circuit breaker for this, is there anything else that might be?
Goodness. It's really, you would have to change the ownership model, and then it would be government that would have to change the ownership model. So I would hope they would take a good hard look at it before they actually did that change. And that's one of the potentials for this freight study, is hopefully they can actually start looking at some of those really difficult but possible mechanisms.
One of the themes that comes through that Ministry of Transport paper quite strongly is climate change and obviously mitigating it. Talks about the development of a circular economy, which is obviously one that produces less waste, more use of data and technology, need for investment. I mean, all of these things. Climate change, everything that the government is doing and talking about at the moment, is climate change features prominently in there and will continue to do so. What can, the freight industry, supply chain participants do on that front? to, I guess, mitigate climate change? Because we still want to send our exports overseas and we still want to import things from overseas. So there's a carbon footprint there for some time to come, I imagine.
Yes, although the carbon footprint of putting things on boats is actually relatively low. Putting things on planes, obviously, that's quite high. But there was a study a while ago done by academics from Lincoln, I think it was, that looked at the food miles and actually showed that growing sheep here, putting them in refrigerated containers and sending to the UK ended up with lower carbon emissions than having to keep the sheep warm all winter in these, large barns that require huge amounts of heating that was done through coal. So, it's not a simple equation in terms of emissions, but I think just measuring it, and that's where we are getting to, is if we at least measure it, we can know where the biggest bang for our buck is. And then we do see things like the ports of Auckland experimenting with their electric tug and their hydrogen that they're experimenting with. So I think there's definitely space for a bit more experimentation and just seeing what's actually going to work in New Zealand.
There's also quite a bit of talk about coastal shipping that's re-emerged in recent years, and I see recently Maersk announced that they're launching a coastal shipping service around New Zealand. I guess obviously in the early days of New Zealand, certainly the early European period, but even the Maori period, ships, wakas, were a way of transporting ourselves around our island nation. It does seem to make sense to use coastal shipping more. What do you think is going to happen with coastal shipping in the next few years?
So the thing that holds back coastal shipping is all the extra handling. So you have to take those containers off and on and off and on, and you're in these fairly constrained ports. And as we go towards more automation, will those costs come down? But of course, Auckland Port's just backed away from its big automation project. So we're not going to be seeing that in the next, 5-10 years probably. But eventually, obviously, we'll be at a point where automation can just, pick up a container, put it down, load it on the electric ship or maybe it's hydrogen, I don't know, but the low emissions coastal ship. So yes, we're going to get more coastal shipping because it is quite a effective way of getting things around. There aren't a lot of hills in the ocean, right? But it's really those handling costs that have made it not used as much these days versus 100 years ago where labour was super cheap, so the handling costs were much less.
You mentioned automation there. I mean, how much is automation and other forms of technology going to change supply chains in coming years, do you think?
I think it's going to have huge changes. So already we're seeing overseas, those little robot things that are doing deliveries on sidewalks. We're not seeing those in New Zealand, but, as you get more and more automation able to pick things up and deliver them and drop them off, then again, those costs of transport go down and ideally go down and are with renewable electricity, so you're not also paying all the emissions costs. But the cost of transport for both people and goods is going to go down, particularly when we have driverless cars. Just think of what you could get done in your car if you weren't actually driving it, right? So again, those costs go down. So we will see more, right? So people might start living even further distances away, which is a challenge for our policymakers because you probably don't want huge numbers of people commuting long distances.
And I mean, I guess in supply chain and freight, will we have driverless trucks?
Yes, and in fact, they already have them in the US doing some of those long haul. I mean, it's not 100% driverless, but it's, changing the freight industry, and it's helping to mitigate the challenge they have in a shortage of drivers. So, yes, eventually we're going to be at a point that you just send things off. They get delivered.
To wrap up, I think it'd be quite interesting to ask you where you would like to see New Zealand's supply chains and
yes.
This freight strategy you talk about. Where would you like to see things in, 5 years or so from now?
I would like to see New Zealand businesses have a thorough understanding of their supply chains, the trade-offs, and making some of these decisions deliberately rather than reactively. So yes, if you're going to carry more stock, good, but know why you're doing it and know the trade-offs around there. So definitely a call to New Zealand businesses to upskill in terms of their supply chain knowledge. Hire some of our supply chain graduates, please. But also I would like government to actually have taken this good hard look at the vulnerabilities of New Zealand supply chains and, are there places they need to be investing? Because there probably are.
Yeah, just on those 2 points, distance and investment, I mean, what are the key issues that distance causes and what are the key areas that could use investment in your view?
So distance causes the issue of your supply chain is less resilient and less responsive. So that's why we see people putting things on planes, because it gets there so much faster. So you can react to changes in customer demand, or you can make up for delayed supply. So distance is a big challenge for New Zealand supply chains. And I think in terms of businesses, they can be thinking about, what can I do to mitigate that? So if I'm an IT business, I don't have the tyranny of distance, right? Or much less, or maybe some people costs, but basically you don't have the tyranny of distance. So thinking about things that are light or weightless is really, I think, where New Zealand can compete more effectively than things that are heavy and are going to take a while to get there on a boat.
And what areas in particular could use some investment?
As you can probably tell, I am a believer in the free market. So I'm not a big fan of government picking winners. I think where we really need investment, and again, I'm biased because I'm an academic, is in much more R&D. I think we really need to be investing in our research ecosystem, in our innovation ecosystem, many more grants for collaborations between startups and academia. I mean, really, let's get this innovation thing rocking. That's where I would like to see. But of course, that's coming from my own biased perspective as an academic.
Well, fair enough. Thanks a lot, Tava. That's Tava Olsen, who is Professor of Operations and Supply Chain Management and Director of the Centre for Supply Chain Management at the University of Auckland Business School. And I'm Gareth Vaughan, and that's been another episode of interest.co.nz's Of Interest podcast.